Hi, this is Andrew Sears again, and welcome to the next section of the course focused on disruptive innovation in education. This section is going to focus on emerging markets and what I call courseware platforms. And just to frame this using the overarching framework for the course, again, there's these innovation extensions, and earlier I talked about the first wave of innovation, which is traditional higher education. Then the next wave, which I've called traditional online education, that might sound kind of funny to some of you who view online education as the latest thing, but I think fairly soon it's going to be displaced by something else that I'm calling courseware platforms and emerging markets. Now, who knows what this is really going to be called once it emerges? I have confidence it's not going to be called MOOCs, but I think there's going to be something out there that is going to have these two characteristics. So let me talk about the big opportunity. So if you look at where the growth of higher education has been globally, in 2000, there was 100 million students in higher education. So if you look at the 1,000-year history of higher education, it took 1,000 years to get to the first 100 million students per year. Then in the next 25 years, you grew by much more than that to 263 million. So it took less than 25 years to add another 163 million. But what's important about that is most of that growth, 84%, is happening in the developing world. So you're talking about 137 million new students per year in developing countries by 2025. So this is really the new map of the world that people need to be getting used to. We like to think about the world in ethnocentric, where we put North America and Western Europe, the, Western countries kind of in the center of the map. We make them look really big, but I think this map shows, it has Africa in the center, has China very prominent, it has South America very prominent. That's where you're going to be seeing a lot of the growth. And the guru in this field is the Prahalad, the author of The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Some people call it bottom of the pyramid, some people call it base of the pyramid. And this is one of the master's courses I actually teach. I've spent most of my life working and living among the poor. So I have a lot of expertise in this, and I teach this course at a graduate level. And if you look at what are the key principles, and the idea of the BOP or BOP innovation and the business models is that there's some key principles where if you're trying to serve the poor, you need to use these. And he listed this list here. So price, performance. So the poor really need to get a good deal. You're going to have innovation. You might have hybrids. Scale is actually probably the number one thing I think that's most important. The price performance really is often about cost. De-skilling of work is absolutely critical. So each of these things are going to be really important as you're approaching, where this 80% of the growth is. And the basic idea of the bottom of the pyramid is that most of the world lives outside of majority, outside of the Western governments. So that forms the base of the pyramid, and there can be significant profits and significant sustainability if you have business models that serve that. So one of the bits of advice I would have is just learn these principles, because I think that that's going to be critical in serving this base. If you look at where Facebook's growth is coming from, if you look at where Apple's growth, where Google's growth is coming from, it's largely coming from the developing world. So the next part, what I want to focus on is the concept of scenario planning. And one of the things I did in my dissertation was I looked at, let's look at a potential future, and then how do we develop strategy based on some potential future. So this is the basic scenario that I've developed. And I did this similar whenever I was at MIT and I co-founded the Internet Telephony Consortium with one of the fathers of the Internet. I did the same thing, and that scenario really formed the foundation of the Internet Telephony Consortium. And we projected a scenario where the majority of global traffic was going to be voice over IP. And at the time, that seemed ludicrous because less than 1% was happening. And just last year, and it's about 20 years ago since we founded the consortium, just last year, the majority of international traffic happened on Skype. So Skype had more international traffic than all phone networks combined. Now, having said that, we still use phones. And I think that that's something, looking at the Skype and voice over IP analogy is actually going to be a good model to learn from. And I think the same thing is going to happen globally. I think globally what you're going to see is 10 times the growth of tertiary education online. And I use the term tertiary education to be much more inclusive than higher education, which I think is really framing it in Western upper middle class terms. I think that somewhere in the time frame of 2035 to 2050, 90% of the degrees are going to be in non-Western countries, and the majority of the world are going to receive degrees and credentials that are nearly free. And it's hard to say exactly when that time frame is going to be. I put 2035 to 2050 because I think there's going to be some uncertainty. Now that's going to be the global scenario. The U.S. scenario is, I think that there's going to be significant loss of government subsidies in public higher education, and that means that state schools are likely to compete in a non-subsidized competitive market. Part of the reason, unless something changes dramatically in the country, in the United States and even in other Western countries, the entitlements are starting to take up most of the budget, and you just have basic demographics that take over at that point, where you just don't have enough to fund discretionary spending on things like higher education. So what that's going to mean is, relative to state schools, private schools are going to continue to grow. So there's been a long-term trend globally of growth of private schools, and that's both private, nonprofit, and for-profit. But their market share is going to continue to increase. I think it's going to increase dramatically. But private higher education is going to experience a major consolidation, and I'll talk about that later. But I think where the competition is going to come from is private schools are going to lose some market share to free services provided on tech platforms. Some of the examples are going to be LinkedIn, Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. Those are the players, really, I think, long-term that people should be concerned about. And I think that the U.S. scenario, 70% of Americans are likely to receive a degree by 2050, with growth primarily coming from low-cost providers. So if you take this as a potential likely scenario, the question is, how do you plan for that? And how do you work strategically to deal with that? So there's another part of this that I talked about in my dissertation, and I broke up higher education into tiers. Part of what I did is that, I read every possible book and paper on disruptive innovation in higher education. I looked at a lot of the scenarios. I've worked in this industry. I'm a college president. I, worked as a consultant in the past, advising, scenario building and things along those lines for future products. So that's where I formed a lot of this. And I think that the future by 2035 is likely to be 5 tiers. So tier 1 is the elite. So if you, read and talk with most of the people who are forecasting, they say, the elite schools, and those are going to be the schools that might serve the top 5%, or if lucky, maybe the top 10%. Those are the Harvards. Those schools are going to be okay. But what's going to happen is their tuition is going to continue to go up. So by 2035, tuition is going to be above $100,000 per year, and that's in 2015 dollars. So it's going to be incredibly challenging to pay for. Now, some of these schools will be able to afford significant discounts and some won't. But there you're talking about an analogy, say, to the New York Times and the Economist, and how they responded to online journalism. So, they were the elite, they survived, but a lot of other newspapers didn't. Some other examples might be organic farming. There's organic farms that are doing things, without using a lot of the factory farming methods, but there's not that many, and the portion of our food that comes from them still is fairly small. And another example might be the luxury watches market, where luxury watches actually are a pretty good case study of fighting off the first wave of digital watches, but I think there's a second wave coming now with Apple's watch and other smart watches that might be more challenging. So then the next tier is going to be tier 2, and this is where most colleges and universities fall, and that's high quality, moderate cost. And most of the forecasts talk about at least 50% in bankruptcy or being merged. Clayton Christensen said that's going to happen in 15 years. I think that he's a little too aggressive. I think he said 15. It might be in 10 years, but I think that likely that will happen by 2035. There, the tuition is going to be $50,000 to $100,000 per year. It's going to be a high-touch experience. That's going to be a part of how they distinguish themselves. There, the analogy in the market would be, say, comparing physical retail stores or possibly cable TV or phone companies. And cable TV and phone companies are actually really good case studies to look at because, again, cable competed with the unbundled, low-cost Netflix by adding in video on demand. So there's ways that you can remain high touch but offer some of the competency-based courses, offer some of the flipped classrooms, some of the blended capabilities that would be analogous to what cable TV is doing. And phone companies have actually survived largely by, they lost, it used to be that the long distance market was half the market, but they decided to move upscale and they moved into the mobile space. So there may be ways to do that, but it's not as apparent right now. So the third tier, and this is really the big new tier that I think is starting to emerge, it's good enough quality, low cost. So that's following Clayton Christensen's approach to saying that in disruptive innovation, you start off with good enough quality. And a lot of these schools, I think, are going to have more than 100,000 students, or they're going to be focused on a very small niche. Their tuition might be $1,000 to $5,000 per year. And, the analogy there is going to be in, it might be the Huffington Post or Netflix or Skype or niche e-commerce, where there's a lot of e-commerce that's thriving. They're not that big, but they have a very well-defined niche. Then tier 4 is the courseware ecosystem small businesses. So these are going to be the people that sell apps, courses, educational content, books, certificates, student services, videos. These are going to be the small businesses. It's going to be like the eBay, Amazon merchants, the bloggers, the self-publishers, the app developers. So they're going to exist, but they're going to be selling largely through tier 5. And tier 5 is what I'm calling is the courseware platforms. And these are platforms that I think are going to have hundreds of millions or possibly billions of students. They're probably going to be mobile first. The best, I think, example that's starting to emerge right now is the merger of LinkedIn and lynda.com. Where LinkedIn can help connect people with jobs, and they're working on what they call the economic graph, and lynda.com can provide the training. But I think that in the future, there's going to be other plays. If you look at, what iTunes U could turn into, what Google Classroom combined with YouTube and Google Android, might turn into. You're starting to see the foundations of what I'm calling these courseware platforms, and there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be competing in that. So the question is, how do you survive in the coming storm? Well, there's 4 lessons. One is, you can innovate and just focus on increasing operational effectiveness and scale. So in the retail world, retail has been brutal in the past 10 or 20 years. Amazon's been a part of that, and e-commerce has been a part of that, but some of it's just overall market consolidation. But you've seen some people who innovate. Target has grown during that period, whereas others just got pounded during that period. So, but you have to grow. Another example is what were the farms that survived? Well, they were the farms that were smart. They went up to scale. They got the right equipment. They didn't buy equipment too early. They didn't buy it too late. They didn't, weren't too innovative. They weren't, too Luddite, but they found the right mix, and, they scaled up. So those are the farms that grew. The second principle is offering both and products to compete. So I already talked about cable TV versus Netflix. The other one would be to become more like the innovators while retaining your strengths. So for a long time, New York Times basically resisted becoming more like a lot of the online distribution channels for news. But recently, I would say that there's been a cultural revolution where they focused and dramatically changed that and started providing a lot more of their content available behind a semi-permeable paywall. And then the last thing is just to focus on digital growth and not physical growth. So Blockbuster, they tried to grow through, adding more and more centers, these colleges that want to add more and more campuses. I think that's going to be a short-term trend compared to, how do you invest in digital growth like Netflix did. So the last part where I want to focus is just recommendations for emerging markets. So, what do you do if you're going to go after the emerging market? So a lot of schools created an online division or extension school division that was semi-autonomous, that operated like a skunkworks. But your skunkworks needs a skunkworks because the dynamics of online, and that's why I called traditional online. Online has become traditional online, is going to be radically different than what these radically affordable providers are. So College for America is an example. The college I run, City Vision University, is trying to play in that space too. And part of what you have to do to compete in that space is you follow bottom of the pyramid principles. You start with a price that emerging market customers can afford, and you design around that. And you price near marginal cost. And there's ways that you can be intelligent about how do you avoid, cannibalizing yourself. If you look at College for America, they're not cannibalizing themselves because they're not going to retail. They're doing a business-to-business strategy in their pricing. The other things you do, use automation, unbundling, and scale from emerging markets to reduce costs in traditional online. So, the unbundling is, you can build on a lot of these platforms that are coming out. Everyone's building on courses using YouTube materials, but there's going to be a lot of other materials. MOOCs aren't anything revolutionary. You can see, I don't pay much attention to them because I think that they're one aspect of unbundling. I'll talk about them more later, but I think all they are is they're a, multimedia book for the most part. Until they get rebundled into something else. The other things are designed for mobile first, for content delivery, because you're going to have 5 billion, maybe 6 billion people with smartphones. Disrupt yourself at the lowest levels, but use marketing and pricing mechanism to limit your cannibalization. And then use lean startup methods with technology as a core competency. Everyone needs to have technology as a core competency. If you look at, the buggy manufacturers and how they got replaced by the automobile manufacturers, is because automobile manufacturers understood motors. The motor in the future is going to be technology. So if you don't have that expertise, it's going to be challenging for you. And last, I'm going to talk about City Vision University. So it's the university that I run as kind of a case study. We just launched a $5,000 online bachelor's degree. We're partnering with Sailor Academy. We offer a $2,000 associate's degree, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to open up new markets. So our tagline is radically affordable education to make a living and a life. And our long-term strategy, we're not that big right now, but this is our long-term strategy, is we want to drive our marginal cost per student, which is closer to $3,000 now. We're trying to drive our marginal cost per student down to $2,000, ultimately down to $1,000. We think it's going to be hard to get much lower than $1,000 with instructor-led courses that are accredited. And the idea is that as we do that, we're going to be opening up a market so we can grow dramatically. And the idea behind bottom of the pyramid is even if you don't have make a huge profit off of each customer, if you have 100,000 customers, you're able to be highly sustainable. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So again, look at the supplemental resources I have. There's going to be some really good videos on global education and other materials, and provide me with your feedback for this section. Thanks a lot.